Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nina Fundiller-Walden, Managing Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholar Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual ritual development. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures from prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community. It is geared to those of us, rabbis, educators, and lay leaders, who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a source sheet that will be sent to you after the lecture. The lectures will also be recorded and accessible on our website. A link to the lectures will be shared with you through email, as well as Dr. Horowitz's email, should you wish to contact him directly. Before I introduce Dr. Horowitz, a couple of housekeeping items. To send questions, please use the Q&A box. Q&A will be held approximately 45 minutes into the lecture. You can post your questions anytime throughout, and he will answer them at the end. The lecture recording will be sent to your email shortly and will also be available on our website, chaimitzvah.org. Dr. Shale Horowitz is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research has examined international and ethnic conflict, the politics of international trade and finance, and the politics of market transition and institutional change. He is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 5 books and over 50 academic articles. His current research interests include ethno-territorial wars and Chinese politics. He regularly visits Israel. And now, I'm proud to introduce to you Shale Horowitz.
Thank you very much, Nina. All right, here we go. So thank you all so much for your interest in this important topic, which we see the significance of now more than ever. So we're going to talk about Israel's struggle for survival over time. And these threats to Israel's existence have always existed since before the state even came into being, at least since the 1920s. But they have evolved into new forms over time. So to begin with, we can say that Israel has been a tremendous success in dealing with these threats, but Israel has many implacable enemies, and these enemies are persistent and inventive in continuing to pursue Israel's destruction. And so Israel will have to be patient and inventive and flexible in responding to them and in continuing to build her strength as she has in the past. This will have to continue for the indefinite future. So we're going to talk about these 4 major types of threats. And military threats, that's obvious direct efforts to destroy Israel, her population, as well as her political existence. Kill and expel her population, as well as destroy the state of Israel militarily, to weaken her economically, to weaken her demographically by preventing Jews from coming to live in Israel, or by undermining the demography of the country, and to weaken her through diplomatic and ideological means. And all of these threats are interrelated. So, for example, the non-military threats are used by her enemies to weaken her militarily and thereby make it easier to destroy her by military means. And so we need to understand all of these threats and how they relate to each other. And these threats are existential because of the nature of Israel's enemies, their determination to destroy her, and the tremendous power that they have. So if you want to look at that picture, just as an example of this, this is a picture of Hitler, of course, with the most important early leader of the Palestinian Muslims, Amin al-Husseini, their leader from the 1920s through the end of the 1948 war. So this shows a meeting between them, which occurred during the period when Husseini went to Germany in order to assist the Nazi regime. And of course, what his primary objective was to work with Hitler to bring the Holocaust to the pre-state land of Israel and to destroy the Jewish population. And of course, this came very close to happening, both through Egypt, it came very close to happening, and southward through the Caucasus during the Stalingrad offensive, it came very close to happening. So we're going to focus most on military threats. Probably about half our time we'll spend on these because this is the primary type of threat. And then we'll talk more briefly about the other threats and how they feed into the military threat. So there are a variety of very significant military threats that Israel has faced, both separately and simultaneously. So the first, which you're very well aware of, is conventional invasion or attrition. Attrition meaning if you can't invade and directly destroy an enemy immediately, you can fight a battle in which you wear down its strength to the point where you're able to conduct the invasion successfully. So conventional assault to destroy Israel, low intensity warfare to weaken Israel, terrorism against civilian targets, and guerrilla warfare against military targets, bombardment of civilian targets. So what I mean by that is you don't conduct conventional military warfare directly against Israel. Rather, you stand off in more protected areas and bombard Israeli population centers or other critical infrastructure, important assets, which are necessary for the survival of the state, to the point where the state is significantly weakened and degraded in its ability to protect itself. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And finally, we'll talk about some significant constraints that Israel faces in meeting these threats, which have to do with her relatively small size and limited resources compared to her enemies. So the first type of military threat, conventional invasion or attrition. So most of you are aware of the major conventional wars that Israel has had to fight. The most dangerous one of all, of course, when she first came into existence in 1947 to 1949, in which she barely survived. Then other major conventional wars in 1956, 1967, 1973. The so-called War of Attrition, mainly involving Egypt, in which Egypt attempted to use attrition to weaken Israel significantly from 1967 to 1970. Now, these conventional threats eventually, because of Israel's ability to defeat her enemies, declined. But as we'll see, the threat evolved into new forms. And furthermore, this threat will return if Israel's ability to deter it weakens. Okay, moving on now to the low intensity types of threats, either against civilians, again, terrorism or guerrilla warfare, military targets. So this has also been a constant going back long before Israel came into existence, starting in the 1920s and even earlier in some cases. So Palestinian militias in the pre-state period, which attacked the pre-state Jewish community, paramilitary forces set up by Arab armies, the PLO, and of course now we have Hezbollah in Lebanon and also in Syria and active in other areas, and Hamas. Now these enemies, although they conducted low intensity attacks, they always sought to maximize the intensity, right? That is, although it seems often like there are very limited attacks only in certain areas or not very frequently, whenever these enemies have been meant to do maximum damage. And we see this in the most recent attacks by Hamas last year on October 7th. These various low-intensity attackers have been separated from Arab and other enemy armies over time in order to minimize direct retaliation against those armies. So that was why the PLO was created. That was why Hezbollah was created, or one of the reasons why Hezbollah was created in Lebanon. But these attackers continue to be backed by sovereign states of various levels of power over time. Now, again, these kinds of low-intensity attacks have been dealt with through defensive measures as well as retaliation, and that has limited them. But again, that has caused the attacks to evolve and take new forms rather than stop because of the implacable nature of many of Israel's enemies. So let's move on to this next type of military threat now, bombardment of Israel, mainly civilian targets, but also military targets. So you don't need to directly invade and take over an enemy in order to weaken it very significantly through direct attack. You can do that by bombardment on a large scale from more secure rear areas. So this has been done by conventional Arab armies. For example, it was done by Syria from the Golan Heights pretty regularly from 1948, from that conflict all the way up until 1967, but more recently done by terror groups which are based in protected areas around Israel's borders. So we have, for example, the PLO in Lebanon in the 1980s, shelling northern areas of Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon more recently, and also in Syria now since the Syrian civil war started. And then we have Hamas since it took over control of Gaza. Now, an important thing to mention here is that these attacks more recently are not isolated to particular areas, and they're not isolated to Gaza, or they're not isolated to Lebanon or Syria. They're part of a larger strategy coordinated by Iran, which is often referred to as the Ring of Fire strategy. So the idea is to encircle Israel with protected bastions from which Israel can be bombarded, thereby drawing Israel into protracted conflicts outside of Israel and weakening her significantly to the point where she can be destroyed by conventional means. And Iran aims to spread these kinds of attacks from Lebanon and Gaza to Syria, plans to overthrow the Jordanian regime and spread them to Jordan and, if possible, to the West Bank, and also to assist in the overthrow of the Egyptian regime and spread them to the Egyptian border. So the goal is that these should encircle Israel to the maximum extent and force her to confront protected enemies in a way that will significantly weaken her. It's very difficult to deter this type of attack because Israel's enemies are committed to her destruction, and they're committed to accomplish it by any means necessary. And they don't care very much about the costs that they or their civilian populations bear as a consequence. So as a result, the most important method that they use to prevent Israel from defeating their ability to conduct this kind of bombardment is to entrench and disperse themselves over large areas where they are protected by civilians, where there are civilian shields, as we see now, for example, in the Gaza war. This is not a threat which remains of a constant nature, and it's just something that you have to deal with wherever it pops up. It also evolves technologically. So the other very dangerous threat that I believe most of you are aware of is the missiles or rockets which are used to attack Israel are becoming more and more numerous and especially sophisticated. That means that they can potentially overwhelm Israel's air defenses, missile defenses, and also that they can be targeted more accurately at critical infrastructure in Israel, such as the electrical grid, or other things like important military bases, civilian command and control centers, or centers of government, and other vital installations and assets. So this is very dangerous. Okay, finally, nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So a number of Israel's enemies have attempted to acquire nuclear weapons in the past. So I'll just mention Iraq, Libya, and most recently Syria. The picture there you see is of a Syrian nuclear reactor being constructed, which was destroyed by Israel in 2007. And it was a copy of the North Korean nuclear reactor built with North Korean assistance in Syria. The most significant nuclear threat, of course, now is from Iran. which has been delayed by a low-intensity warfare against installations and scientists conducted by Israel, but which has been making steady progress and is nearing success now. So Iran is on the brink of acquiring nuclear weapons. So this is extremely dangerous, and I'll explain that more in a moment. Also, chemical and even biological weapons. Many of Israel's enemies have large chemical weapons stocks. They may have biological weapons capabilities. Israel has to prepare to deal with these kinds of threats. Other threats of this kind, which people don't think about, for example, in the past, Syria, backed by other of Israel's enemies, has attempted to divert Israel's water sources so that Israel would lose the ability to have significant water resources. So Israel's enemies are always looking for ways of attacking her in the most devastating ways. If we think about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, it's very scary because this is not just Iran itself threatening to use nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons would be used as a shield behind which to intensify the ring of fire strategy by Iran. So Iran would attempt to deter Israel from retaliating against bombardment and other types of attacks by threatening to use nuclear weapons. And it's even conceivable that Iran could transfer nuclear weapons to Hezbollah or other of its proxies. And it's very scary if you imagine a scenario like that. So imagine if Hezbollah and or Hamas possess nuclear weapons. Also, Iran acquiring nuclear weapons increases the likelihood that other states in the region, such as Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt, will also acquire nuclear weapons. All of these regimes are unstable or unpredictable, and it's difficult to anticipate what they might do with such nuclear weapons. The more enemies that you have with nuclear weapons, the more dangerous it is, of course. Finally, in dealing with these military threats, I'll just explain some of the constraints that Israel faces. So one is space, of course. Israel is very small. If you look at the distance from the northern part of the West Bank there to the Mediterranean, we're dealing with something like 10 to 15 miles. So you can drive a tank across that distance if there's no resistance in 25 or 30 minutes, and you've cut the country in half. And the same kinds of constraints exist for bombardment of Israel. That is, if Israel can be bombarded from many places, including all of its periphery at the same time, makes it much more difficult to deal with the threat. So therefore, Israel's strategists have always tried to anticipate attacks and to fight on enemy territory or to preempt the attacks. But this is very difficult and very costly. Israel faces resource and technology constraints. Israel's enemies have much greater resources in terms of population and economic resources. Therefore, Israel has to build up her own economic strength, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively, and acquire a technological edge, the so-called qualitative edge, and preserve that so that she can maintain her military power and deterrence. In protracted wars, Israel needs to mobilize large parts of her civilian population to fight, but this is very difficult to sustain because it imposes huge costs on the economy. If Israel is engaged in protracted wars, like in 1947 to 1949 or 1973, or now, Israel has difficulty continuing to supply her military and must rely on external sources of supply. This is also dangerous because it creates dependence on external supporters that may not be reliable. And finally, Israel is vulnerable to great power pressure or intervention because of her dependence on external powers and the ability of great powers potentially to assist her enemies. So, for example, in the early War of Independence, 1947 to 1949, Great Britain assisted Israel's enemies, especially Jordan and Egypt. Israel was subject to an arms embargo and was significantly assisted in her survival, paradoxically, by a brief period in which the Soviet Union ignored the international arms embargo and provided Israel with weapons. And of course, since the 1960s, Israel has become dependent on the United States for weapons and military technology. So these are also constraints that Israel faces. Okay, just more briefly, we're going to summarize the other threats that Israel faces. So Israel faces significant economic threats by virtue of her small size relative to her enemies. That requires continued rapid economic development. The way you do that in the modern world is through specialization. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Israel has achieved tremendous success in this area, but it means that there's no way to avoid economic dependence on the outside world. It's unavoidable and necessary, and you just have to adapt to it. So that means, of course, that there's a major risk of economic sanctions or boycotts or other types of efforts to weaken Israel from the outside by limiting her contact, her ability to engage in trade, investment, and technology transfer with the rest of the world. Israel has adapted, as I mentioned, very successfully. In the early period of her economic development, of course, Israel emphasized state-led economic development because of the need to build infrastructure and military capability that would allow her to survive. But over time, she adapted as necessary to facilitate economic development by market-based specialization in the international economy. And Israel achieved an unbelievable success over time, especially in the high technology areas. So many of you can take a look at this graphic on the right for more details and look this up, but it's astounding how successful Israel has been in specializing across the whole range of high technology industries, to the point where Israel is usually regarded as the second most important center of high technology development in the world after the United States, which is astonishing given her small size. So this has been a tremendous success, but again, it creates this dependence, and Israel has no choice but to pursue this strategy. You have to specialize, make yourself as useful as possible to others, integrate into their supply chains, and provide them with value in a variety of areas. At the same time, you have to maintain the absolute minimum capabilities which are necessary for your survival under your own control. To the extent you need to pay for those and be self-sufficient to those in a way that you would not through market-based specialization, you need to maximize your ability to develop specializations in those areas and also be able to export goods made in those areas. So this is something Israel has succeeded in doing in arms production. Okay, let me talk about briefly demographic threats now. Now, if you look on the graph there, you can see the astonishing speed of increase in Israel's population. So it's over 10 times larger than it was when Israel came into existence in 1948 and continuing to grow very rapidly. Demographically and economically, Israel has achieved amazing success. So Israel is approximately the size in terms of population and economy of Sweden now, which is a kind of middle power in Europe. So this is an amazing success. So to focus on the demographic side, Israel has been incredibly vulnerable in this area. So before the state came into existence, especially, Israel was vulnerable to activity by the Ottomans and the British that struck at the size or potential size of the Jewish population. So during World War I, for example, as a result of hardship and forced deportations by the Ottomans, the Jewish population was reduced by 1/3 in the current land of Israel. And if the Ottomans had feared Jews more, they would have implemented the kinds of policies they did against the Armenians and Greeks, and the Jewish population could have been obliterated at that time. Under the British, of course, although the British initially accepted the idea of a Jewish national home and began to allow immigration, they stopped allowing that in the run-up to World War II. And in the few years before World War II broke out, and in the early years of World War II, when large numbers of Jews could have escaped Europe, they largely prohibited this. So as a result of those restrictions, hundreds of thousands of Jews that would otherwise have come to Israel were killed in the death camps. And then, of course, after World War II, the British prevented Jews from coming into Israel and fortifying the pre-state Jewish community until independence was actually declared. Now, since independence, Israel has succeeded in increasing its population and maintaining a large Jewish majority through two means: immigration and maintaining a sufficiently high birth rate. And more recently, Israel's birth rate has been rising very impressively. Israel is unique among developed countries in the world in maintaining a very high birth rate, now about 3 children per woman. And this recently has become the birth rate than of the Muslim population in Israel. So this is very important in maintaining a Jewish majority within Israel, a large Jewish majority within Israel. This issue also limits what Israel can do in the West Bank and Gaza. So Israel has wanted to maintain control in these areas in order to protect itself, but it cannot fully annex these areas because that would mean absorbing large Arab populations into Israel and potentially threatening the Jewish demographic majority. So that means that Israel has to pursue flexible solutions to this problem. Israel cannot accept the 1967 borders because those borders are too vulnerable. On the other hand, Israel cannot absorb these regions entirely. So Israel has to separate itself from these large Arab population centers while at the same time protecting its population from military assault and maintaining a direct control over territories which are judged to be especially important to the state, both for historical reasons and for defense reasons, such as the areas around Jerusalem. So there's no simple solution to this problem. There's no one solution to this problem, but there are many solutions that are possible. The last point I'll mention by this is that Israel's enemies used to say that Israel was doomed to slow destruction because of its low birth rates. But of course, Israel's birth rate, as we mentioned, gradually grew to the point where this is no longer a threat. Now, Israel's enemies claim that Israel is doomed by a high birth rate because the part of Israel's population that has the highest birth rate is the ultra-Orthodox population. And the ultra-Orthodox population does not serve in Israel's army in a regular way, in the way that other parts of its population do. And so people argue that this creates a significant danger in the long run. I think that the threat is exaggerated, but it's something that needs to be dealt with, again, through flexible solutions. Many solutions are possible. Many are being pursued now, and we can do a better job of that. Israel can do a better job of that in a way which integrates these populations into Israel's military and other service needs without imperiling their way of life. Okay, so the last type of threat that I'll just mention briefly are the diplomatic and ideological threats. This is much more significant than most people realize. So the most direct axis of attack is to attempt to impose binding economic sanctions on Israel through the United Nations, especially through the Security Council. So Israel's enemies seek to stop Israel from importing arms or military technology and engaging in any kind of international trade or investment or technology transfer, for that matter. In other words, they want to strangle Israel's military and economic capacities through economic sanctions. Why are Israel's enemies so powerful in the United Nations and other international organizations? It's important to explain this briefly. So the reason for this is because of the sheer number of countries that have joined the coalition engaged in this all-out war against Israel. So the core of this coalition is the Arab League of 21 countries. So this group of countries cooperates with the PLO to author all the anti-Israel resolutions, which are constant in every imaginable form, in every imaginable forum in international organizations. And why are they able to do that so successfully? Because they operate through larger circles of diplomatic alliance. The first is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation of 57 countries, of which 48 are Muslim majority countries. So within this organization, the Arab League can get the members to do whatever it wants and support whatever resolutions or strategies it wants. And then there's a larger non-aligned movement of countries that traditionally were hostile to the West, allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, of 120 countries currently. And they too typically vote in lockstep with the Arab League. So there's a kind of, you can think of this as analogous to sort of shell companies. You control the Arab League, then through that you control the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, then through that you control the non-aligned movement, and then you have a large majority of the total 193 countries in the United Nations. During the Cold War, of course, this group of countries was allied with the old Soviet bloc, the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and was allied and continues to be allied with China as well. So in addition to the near enemy of countries and groups and movements which threaten Israel directly, this diplomatic war is conducted by a far enemy, a much larger coalition of governments whose energy is fueled by the ideological movements of Islamic extremism and the far left or the radical left. And their rhetoric, which they use to justify this diplomatic war against Israel, is a rhetoric of annihilation. They paint Israel as demonic. You're all aware of this rhetoric, this type of attack, which was pioneered by the old Soviet Union and which is aimed at a leftist audience around the world. In other words, within the Islamic world, the war against Israel ideologically is primarily couched in Islamic extremist terms, but to the rest of the world, it's primarily couched in terms of leftist ideology. So there, Israel is called Nazi, apartheid, settler colonialist, racist, all the worst terms of abuse from the point of view of leftist ideology. And Israel has no right to defend itself. Anything Israel does to defend herself is branded as genocide. So trends in this diplomatic and ideological war. So in recent decades, there have been some positive trends. The collapse of the Soviet Union significantly weakened the far left around the world and significantly weakened this part of the far enemy that Israel faces. The Islamic extremist attacks that have been conducted, especially since 9/11, but it started earlier than that in the West and across the developing world, for that matter, not just in the West, have raised awareness about Islamic extremism, radical Islam, and therefore have created more sympathy for Israel around the world than existed before. But the far left never gave up hating Israel and has now aligned itself with the Islamic extremists in the war against Israel. And recently we see an example of this in the rise of this far left faction within the Democratic Party in the United States. So this is the most important area where all of us can fight back against Israel's enemies and do our job to deal with the existential threats faced by Israel. So we have to do two major things. And for those of you that are interested in more detail, here I am repeating some of the points which I made at greater length in my last lecture on how Israel compares. So first of all, we have to defend Israel. The facts make it very easy to defend Israel. Israel is among the most moderate of all states involved in similar conflicts in the world, of which there are dozens of other states. Most moderates in terms of her recognition that her enemies have similar rights to her recognition that she will need to compromise with her enemies, moderate in the means she uses, that is in the effort she makes to minimize civilian casualties when she's forced to fight, And this moderation exists despite the fact that Israel faces by far the greatest threat of any states threatened in these types of conflicts or any other types of international conflicts for that matter around the world. So the first thing is to defend Israel by talking about what Israel is rather than the way that her enemies paint her. But the second and equally necessary and important measure is to fight back against Israel's enemies and to brand them as what they are. That is among the most extreme of all states, groups, and ideologies in the world, the most extreme in their goals, where they seek to impose their ideologies and their way of life on the rest of the world, and willing to use all means necessary to achieve those goals, regardless of the human costs. And so when these enemies single out and vilify Israel in their war of annihilation, they are not just engaging in anti-Semitism, they're not just denying Israel's right to self-determination, they're not just using double standards to attack Israel, but they are participating in this war of destruction. But Israel's enemies are the enemies of most of the rest of the world. These same groups that are threatening Israel are threatening the rest of the world. Now, when they finish with Israel, if they ever do, they will redirect their strength and their energy to attack the rest of the world. And the sympathy that we see in much of the rest of the world with Israel, despite this ideological attack, is a result of this awareness in much of the world. An interesting example, which I'll just point out to you, is that you're all aware, I'm sure, that Lula, the president of Brazil, called Israel a Nazi state engaged in genocide. Nothing new for far leftists, right? That's typical. But the response in Brazil was a huge backlash by Brazil's centrist and rightist forces in support of Israel. Why? Because much of this population is sympathetic to Israel because they understand what radical Islam is. So in parts of the world where Israel never had any friends or any sympathy in the past, she does now because of the realization of the rest of the world of what her enemies are and of the threat that they pose. So we can participate in this defense of Israel and strike back at her enemies by educating ourselves and others whenever and wherever we can, and by joining some of the many excellent organizations that are taking part in this effort. For example, what I do is there are so many excellent organizations. I can't read or participate in everything they do, so I'm limited to doing certain things, but I try to donate money. I try to become a member of all of these organizations or make others aware of them, just to help as many of them as possible and to participate as much as possible. So that is what we can all do. And just to conclude, Israel continues to face these implacable enemies. The threats continue to evolve and take very complex, dangerous forms. But Israel has met these threats in the past and continued to become stronger and stronger. Israel can and will continue to do that in the past. In order to do that, Israel needs to avoid wishful thinking and complacency about her enemies, of the kind that allowed the attack on October 7th, for example. But no country is perfect, so Israel cannot be perfect, and these kinds of setbacks are unfortunately unavoidable over time. You can just try to minimize them. Israel has to attempt to continue to build and sustain her strength, face all of these threats realistically and effectively, and wait for her enemies to moderate. There is no magic bullet. There is no quick solution. There is only patience over very long time horizons. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Shale. This was so informative and actually encouraging. We have some interesting questions here. The first one has to do with international law. This one person asks, Haven't Israel's enemies always used the fact to their advantage that Israel's ally, the USA, has always stopped Israel from continuing to defend itself and thereby cause its enemies to continue to fight Israel? Even now, the USA and others are calling for a ceasefire without Israel truly defending itself via international law.
This is a very difficult problem. And unfortunately, again, I can't give a simple answer to this problem. Israel, because of her small size, is unavoidably dependent on outside support, and in particular on the United States, because it's not just that the United States can withhold aid or demand that Israel stop fighting or change her methods of fighting. Under the wrong president, the United States can allow sanctions resolutions to pass through the Security Council. This is very dangerous, and it means that Israel has to mount a continued, long-standing effort to maintain support in the United States and in other significant countries. And this is very difficult, and there's no avoiding it.
That leads us to two related questions. One person asks, what do you believe, or what do you see as the more effective measures Israel can take against the military threats that they're currently facing? Sunni Arab countries potentially see Iran and its proxies as a threat against their countries. What is Israel doing now to work with these countries to act as a counter to Iran, Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies? And a related question, do you believe Iran wants Hezbollah to escalate a war with Israel at this time?
Okay. So first of all, I would say that in working with mutual enemies of Iran, Israel should do whatever it can, okay, working with common enemies of Iran. But these possible allies, although they are important in the long run for moving toward peaceful relations in the region, they are certainly not going to do Israel's fighting for it, just like much closer allies, such as the United States, are not reliably ever going to do Israel's fighting for it. Israel has to depend upon her own strength and her abilities while navigating through the limited assistance that allies can provide to her. Now, speaking about Iran, there are the two difficult threats, right? There's the Ring of Fire threat, which most importantly comes from Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria. And then there is the far threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. Israel has avoided a full-scale war with Hezbollah because it will be even more costly and protracted than the one that's going on now in Gaza. But it may be unavoidable. But Israel certainly doesn't want to conduct that war now while it is trying to finish the war in Gaza, or at least bring it to manageable proportions. In terms of confronting Iran more generally, it's very difficult because the Iranian nuclear program is dispersed across many regions of Iran. Israel can strike at it in ways it hasn't already, in more direct ways, but those strikes are not going to be decisive. Iran will continue with its program. So the only long-term security vis-a-vis Iran that Israel will ever achieve is regime change. Without a change in the regime, this threat is not going to change fundamentally, and Israel is going to be faced with potentially catastrophic risks and wars.
Thank you. So another question is, most of us learned that the realist school of thought in international relations tells us that we should assume that nations act to advance their interests in power and security, even if their leaders use rhetoric that suggests more emotional or rational motivations. Is the realist school of thought wrong about the actions of Israel's enemies?
First of all, the realist school of thought is not one school of thought. People tend to take one of its forms and assume that that's the general point of view taken. There's an extreme point of view of realist thought that tends to discount the importance of leaders, ideologies, governments, and argue that all states are equal fundamentally. and therefore that all states can be dealt with in the same way, deterred in the same way. So I think that that's clearly wrong. Okay, so for example, obviously Hamas is not a leadership in that sense, right? It's willing to risk its destruction, as we see in a war against a much more powerful enemy, in order to try to weaken that enemy, if there's a significant chance that it can thereby weaken that enemy. And Iran is a much more powerful, dangerous version of such a regime. And these regimes may be willing to accept gigantic costs in order to achieve their radical ideological goals. So, for example, many in the Iranian leadership have spoken openly about using nuclear weapons against Israel. And we know that Israel would retaliate with its own nuclear weapons in that case, right? So, in other words, they talk openly about engaging in a nuclear war and accepting massive destructions of their populations in order to destroy Israel. So we know that Israel has enemies that are not realist in the sense of being easily deterred by the risk of military defeat and the risk of large costs of war.
Right. This is a probably could give a quick answer to this because it relates to it. Do you believe Israel and the world will stop Iran from getting nukes, or is the world resolved to knowing that Iran cannot be stopped? Kind
Well,
of relates.
I think that we know that no one is going to stop Iran, most likely, except for Israel.
Mhm.
So the United States could assist in delaying Iran, or possibly some of the other allies that Israel has may assist her. But this is not the same thing as just destroying the Syrian nuclear reactor in one strike and then they're back to square one. It's going to be very difficult to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Israel is going to have to rely largely on her own strength and methods in doing that. And it's a very difficult problem. It's not clear exactly what benefits can be achieved by bombing directly. That's a matter for military experts. Israel may have to have recourse to that at some point, but it's not a magic bullet because of how dispersed and protected the Iranian nuclear program is. So it's going to be very difficult to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons as long as this regime is in power.
And this is kind of related also. Where does Russia and China fit into the threat scenario?
So Russia and China are not ideological enemies of Israel in the way that the Soviet Union became during the Cold War. That is, they are not dedicated with all of their own strength and influence to Israel's destruction, but they are much more likely to ally with Israel's enemies because of their numbers and the way in which they can provide assistance to both Russia and China. And we see that in the current conflict. So Vladimir Putin had not really been hostile to Israel before the Syrian civil war and in the early part of the Syrian civil war. But now in the war in Ukraine, Iran can provide Russia with very important military assistance. So as a result of that, Russia is drawn closer to Iran and is probably providing Iran with very dangerous technologies now, which can speed up her nuclear program and her ability to deliver various kinds of, conduct various kinds of attacks on Israel. China is very similar. China conducts a purely transactional foreign policy. China has a lot more to gain by cooperating with Israel's enemies than with Israel. Therefore, China is going to cooperate with Israel's enemies more than with Israel.
Yes, there are a lot of questions along this line, but I think I am going to just move over to one about the UN. What should or can Israel do regarding the UN, where it's hugely outvoted by Arabs and their allies, an alliance which not only overwhelms the rights of Israel in voting on many issues, but also is able to insinuate a separate refugee rights organization, such as UNRWA, of course, in order to persist in undermining Israel?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, I'll take the latter point first, which is that Israel's enemies have succeeded in turning the UN into an instrument in the war against Israel. Okay, so far we have mentioned the ideological war. I mean, they've basically turned the UN into a propaganda organization. A large part of everything what the UN does, not just the General Assembly, but all the subsidiary organizations, is just to attack Israel, and in the most absurd ways, however they can. But also the various forms of humanitarian assistance and activity that the UN engages in are weaponized against Israel. So the aid that was provided, for example, through UNRWA, the refugee organization, that's provided through various other aid organizations, essentially was used to finance Hamas. How is that? Not just directly by Hamas taking those resources for itself, but by providing Hamas with the resources it needs to run its state in Gaza, such that Hamas could devote almost all of its resources to the war effort. So that is indirectly financing the war effort. It's as simple as that. If Hamas did not have that aid to rely upon, it would have had to divert a large portion of its military effort to supplying existence to the population, supplying services to the population. So yes, the UN is part of the war against Israel, and there is no way to stop that given the huge coalition which joins in the war against Israel through the UN. So there's not a lot that Israel can do in the UN. Israel can speak truth back to its vicious enemies by calling them what they are. Israel can try to slowly build more and more alliances with a larger number of countries that are sympathetic to Israel. But the greatest successes in this area will occur outside of the UN. That is, they'll occur through usually bilateral diplomatic channels. And the UN will not come around to ending the war on Israel until every other threat to Israel is gone. It will be probably the very last thing to change. So I do not hold out any hope on that front for the foreseeable future. And Israel's diplomatic and informational efforts have to be concentrated in other arenas where it can have greater success.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. We really need to wrap up, unfortunately. But people whose questions were not answered, we can answer them by email at another time. The maybe a good way to wrap up. Let's see. Okay. How can we spread true facts versus showing the fake news? We're talking about that to some extent. So how would you answer that and perhaps wrap up?
It's a very difficult question. Okay, one of the reasons why it's difficult is that the way that information is conveyed to people has changed. It's not in a small number of mass media organizations, which unfortunately are predominantly hostile to Israel, either very hostile or just somewhat hostile. But now it also is occurring on the internet and especially through social media. And the problem is the so-called information bubbles, right? That is the way that people consume information in social media is usually through algorithms which feed them reinforcing content. So those which are consuming anti-Israel information are being fed even more and more virulent anti-Israel information. So this tends to produce what analysts call polarization, right? That is, you have two information spaces, one with a more pro-Israel point of view or a more friendly point of view, and one with a more anti-Israel point of view. And it becomes harder to reach those that have the anti-Israel point of view. So again, this is a very difficult nut to crack. And I think it's largely a strategy issue. I'm not an expert on this area, but a lot can be done in this area. You have to try to penetrate as many audiences as possible in these spaces that are less accessible to you, and reach them by various means. And there are various strategies which can be used to do this, and there are excellent organizations that we can support that are making this effort.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your whole illuminating talk and for some of the encouraging solutions or ideas you've shared. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I wish we had more time because we have a lot more questions, but we will try to get some information to you in our follow-up email. Our next Scholar Circle lecture will feature Scott Shea, the founder and board president of Chai Mitzvah and the author of 3 books. His most recent book, Conspiracy U, a case study, challenges the proliferation of anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist conspiracy theories on college campuses from the far right and the far left. The topic of that webinar will be Unmasking Conspiracy Theories, a closer look at their migration from universities to the public sphere. And this lecture will be on March 11th at 7 p.m. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good evening, and thank you again, Shale.
Thank you.